An owner who creates a company is much like parents who bring a child into the world. They raise the child to a certain stage, and then at some point they have to let go. I think the same applies to business.
At some stage, you either have to trust hired professionals, entrust them with your capital, sensitive information, company secrets, know-how, and so on, or remain within the limits you are already in.
As one owner once said, our board helps him avoid destroying his own business.
In other words, it protects the business from the owner.
In general, the role of a CEO or an owner's CEO is a very lonely one.
Is it good or bad when the owner also serves as the chair of the board? Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Board of Directors with Sergiy Bulavin channel. From time to time, we, as members of supervisory and advisory boards, encounter situations where the business owner is simultaneously the CEO. Or, for example, where there are several owners who are directly involved in the day-to-day management of the company. These situations clearly have specific characteristics that must be taken into account both when establishing a board and in the board's ongoing work. Today we will explore this topic together with my colleagues, board members, Nina Dobrovska, Armen Korginyan, and Dmitro Kozlov.
Hello, friends.
There is a widely held and well-supported view among experts that owners, by their nature, are entrepreneurs. They created the business and accordingly used their entrepreneurial skills to build and grow it. At the same time, as a company grows, both the company itself and its governance require a more systematic approach, which from time to time may demand an entirely different set of skills from those who lead the business. And at this point, it is generally accepted that a business needs to bring in an external CEO. In reality, however, the situation is far less straightforward because many businesses are run by their owners from the very beginning all the way to a fairly large scale, and they grow and develop quite successfully. On the other hand, there are also examples where the owner stepped away from day-to-day management, hired an external CEO, and the business effectively declined afterward. Colleagues, what are your thoughts on why there are so many companies in Ukraine that are owner-managed?
First of all, I do not think this is unique to Ukraine. In my view, this is a universal phenomenon. When I was on my way to our meeting today, I was preparing and reflecting on this topic, and an analogy came to mind. An owner who creates a business is like parents who give birth to a child. They create the child, they raise them to a certain age, and then eventually they let go, some sooner, some later. Some continue to support them throughout their life. I think the same applies to business. Much depends on the owner and first and foremost on how they relate to themselves, to their knowledge and their expertise, whether they believe they know best or not. Coming back to the question, I believe this is not just a Ukrainian phenomenon, it exists globally.
It is simply that businesses in Ukraine are relatively young, like 20 to 30 years old. Globally, there are companies that are 100 years old or even older. So the statement that this model is more widespread in Ukraine is valid, but it has clear historical and evolutionary reasons behind it. You create a business, you grow it, and everything evolves together naturally and in parallel. You do not even question whether it could be done differently. That process takes time, 20 to 30 years. From my perspective, this is simply a matter of evolution. But now we have reached a point where these businesses that are 20 to 30 years old are exactly at the stage where the question arises, what comes next, and whether relying solely on the owner's energy and personal involvement is the best path forward. Whether owner-driven management alone is sustainable in the future.
In my view, this is a very interesting question. Francis Fukuyama, in addition to his book The End of History, for which he was heavily criticized, as history clearly did not end with the triumph of liberal democracies, also wrote a book on trust and belief. In it, he makes a very compelling point. The transition from an owner-managed company, or one run by family members, is in many ways a cultural and even quasi-religious shift. There are countries, for example, Italy, that have relatively few truly global Italian corporations, perhaps with the exception of certain fashion brands. At the same time, Italy has many companies that manufacture equipment. There are a lot of them, but they tend to remain largely local or at most European in scale. Why is that? Because there is a cultural paradigm in which the owner manages the company up to a certain level of development, after which family members are brought in. This creates a model of family production or family entrepreneurship, which has natural limits, simply because at some point you run out of people within the family, and then a transition becomes necessary. At that stage, you either have to trust professional managers and trust them them with your capital, sensitive information, company secrets, know-how, and so on, or remain within the boundaries you have already reached. Some companies make this transition. For example, American corporations, at a certain point, place their trust in competent executives, hire them, and delegate real decision-making authority to management and boards. Others do not. That shift toward trusting external professionals never happens, and they remain within the framework of a family company, whether a very large family company or a smaller one. This period of building trust, when an owner comes to understand that professionals can be trusted, has roots that go back hundreds of years, shaped by how a society and the collective mindset of a nation have evolved.
Another factor that plays a role is ambition, whether it is present or absent. In the United States, ambition is cultivated from childhood, the desire to grow, to achieve more, to expand further. In Europe, and in Italy in particular, the mindset is often closer to "this is enough, our family lives well."
To avoid taking risks?
Yes, especially risks that could affect future generations. That may also be the case.
Another factor, by the way, is the development of IPOs and stock exchanges, where they do not, and in other jurisdictions they do. This tends to push companies to corporatize much faster. In other words, to move away from dependence on a single individual toward more institutional corporate structures. We almost don't have this factor.
It is probably normal that an owner has a choice, either to pursue globalization, systematize the business and build a corporation, or to remain a family company, or perhaps not strictly a family company, but still a business personally managed by the owner.
This latter model often resembles more of a lifestyle business or even a hobby. The owner simply enjoys being involved. It remains interesting to them even after 40 or 50 years. They may not have strong ambitions to scale further. They simply enjoy what they do, and that too is perfectly valid.
Are there any signals that indicate the moment has come for an owner to consider handing over management to a professional executive?
That is an interesting question. To me, it is similar to alcoholism. An alcoholic can only be helped once they acknowledge, "I understand that I am an alcoholic." The same applies here. The owner must recognize that they are ready for change. They must be able to say, "I know that there are things I do not know," or "I know that I need different expertise or additional capabilities." That realization then pushes them toward establishing boards, bringing in advisors, or hiring external professionals. There's also another scenario, the family dimension. An owner invests their entire life in the business, and over time comes to the realization, "I have spent 20 years on this. Now I want to devote more time to my family."
I think this is a very strong point about personality and inner awareness, about one's own state. To me, this is where a real key lies. Because when people believe they already have answers to all the questions, when company leaders feel they do not need anything or anyone else, then naturally nothing really changes in that state. As a result, leadership remains highly concentrated around a single individual. The moment awareness emerges that perhaps not all the answers are there, that there may be challenges with growth or with achieving strategic objectives, and an understanding that the company does not have sufficient internal capabilities to deliver on those strategic goals. That, in my view, is the critical moment when recognizing one's own limitations comes into play. This may sound like a weakness, but it is actually a superpower. The ability to acknowledge, I have a vision, but it is built together, built through the contribution of many people. At that point, other people are needed, other structures that will also challenge, develop, and strengthen the owner through diverse perspectives and experiences. That is precisely the moment to start thinking about change.
Nina also prompted me to think of another indicator. The moment when what the owner is doing no longer brings the same level of satisfaction as it did 1, 2, or 3 years ago. That, I think, can be the first signal that something is off, whether it is fatigue, burnout, or simply a lack of time.
Burnout, loss of interest, or the emergence of a new business that is more interesting and more challenging. There can be many subjective and objective factors at play.
Many owners utilize this entrepreneurial drive into startups or new business lines they begin to explore. And, of course, combining that with hands-on operational management becomes quite difficult. Colleague, don't you think that we may be slightly idealizing the role of an external CEO and at the same time understating the importance and expertise of business owners? After all, they are the ones who came up with the idea. They are the ones who built and developed the company. And the very fact that the company has grown and did not go bankrupt 1 or 2 months after its creation is, in itself, the owner's achievement. Owners understand the market, they understand the competitive landscape, and, frankly, I am confident that many of them could outperform a large number of specialists who are narrowly focused on specific functions.
I will come back to my analogy with a child. I agree with you. The owner has raised the child, and at some point the child does need to be let go and become independent. Otherwise, if the child remains under constant parental supervision, nothing good will come of it.
That said, I would like to speak in defense of the idea that owner involvement in the business is a positive factor. And by the way, I would like to give examples from large corporations. I spent many years working in the corporate sector and in large companies, including Henkel. 50% of this company is still owned by the Henkel family. And this is a major differentiator compared to competitors such as Procter & Gamble or Kraft Foods, which are fully public companies with a very broad shareholder base. One thing I observed very clearly is that companies without a strong anchor owner tend to be heavily oriented towards short-term results. In practice, their entire activity is driven by share price dynamics and quarterly results, which directly affect stock valuation. As a result, companies are forced to operate very pragmatically within a short-term performance horizon. This often means aggressive cost-cutting and underinvestment in strategic initiatives that require a longer-term horizon and may negatively affect short-term results. This too is a real limitation. For a long time, Henkel had a clear advantage in not being fully dependent on these short-term pressures. In recent decades, however, they have also become more focused on quarterly results, and this shift was visible. I saw it firsthand. But there is another example, Mars, which as far as I know is also 100% owned by the Mars family. I followed this company closely for many years, back when I was still at Nestlé, and it was able to move very aggressively and very quickly. At times, it deliberately sacrificed short-term profits in favor of long-term value. This is precisely where, even at the level of large corporations, owner involvement can be a real advantage. When the owner believes in the idea and in the mission, they can take far more decisive and aggressive investment decisions that may ultimately deliver exceptional results.
So it is not necessarily the case that the owner must step away completely, right? What we are really talking about is a change of roles. The owner may wear fewer hats: CEO, owner, decision maker. They can remain involved by establishing a board and joining that board while still staying closely connected to the company's governance. All that expertise and institutional knowledge remains extremely valuable and stays within the company. I would also like to support Nina's point about private versus public companies. I spent many years first working in an American multinational company, and later that company was acquired by a Japanese owner. When it was American owned, we truly worked for the shareholders. There had to be reports, numbers. When the Japanese acquired the company, everything changed fundamentally. A long-term strategy emerged that is very much the Japanese approach, and the entire mindset shifted.
And even if we look beyond public companies, we know that the average tenure of a CEO is around 4 to 5 years. Naturally, a significant amount of that time is spent on onboarding, understanding the business, setting priorities, and building plans before real value creation begins. That means the truly productive window may be only 3 to 4 years. Within that time frame, it is genuinely difficult to design and fully implement a comprehensive strategy. I believe this ultimately comes down to different skill sets and competencies.
In other words, identifying a niche, launching a business, raising capital, and getting something off the ground, and then systematizing and scaling it are fundamentally different skill sets that are required at different stages. It is great when both sets of skills are combined in one person. We do see such examples, but this is not a requirement. Very often, an owner comes to this realization through pain. When they run into routine work, day-to-day people management, and the burden of systematizing processes. At that point, the classic instinct is to step out of operations. A smart owner understands that this is simply about different competencies. They have not become worse at what they do. Their entrepreneurial drive has not disappeared. It is just that some people are builders, while others are developers, and these can be different people with different skills.
That said, for the sake of objectivity, I know many owners who understand their businesses down to the smallest details. And it is precisely this level of detail that energizes them and that they genuinely enjoy. They like optimizing the business, improving processes, and making things better and better.
If they have enough energy to manage everything manually in this way, there is no issue at all. I have also seen cases where that energy runs out for different reasons: age, changing interests, family priorities, or something else. That is when the question arises, how do you replace this level of involvement? This depth of detail is built over years of hands-on work, and how can it be replaced? I think this is where many owners' fears come from. I have spent 20 years knowing this business inside out, and now someone will come in who does not have all of that. And how will all this work out? These fears of the owners, I believe, are very real. From my own perspective, having experience as a CEO of a large corporation, now being a managing partner in my own business and having served on boards, I see this from multiple angles, and I strongly believe that the size of the business matters a great deal. When a business is very small, this level of detail truly matters, but when a business becomes large, diving into details can actually be counterproductive and may even slow the company's development.
Micromanagement and everything that comes with it.
We had a case where an owner had built their business and genuinely understood every detail, but after many years they were simply exhausted. And it took us quite some time to explain that we would never be able to find another you. Whoever comes in will inevitably be weaker, simply because they are not the person who built this company, and that is something the owner has to come to terms with.
Moreover, I want to remind Dmitry of several projects where we actually convinced owners that at that particular moment they should remain in the company and continue in an operational role.
Yes, that happened.
A board was created so that all board decisions and plan changes could be implemented very quickly and effectively. What was needed was the owner's support precisely in the role they were already in, that is, in operational management.
So does this mean that during a crisis the owner may return to operations?
In that particular case, it was not a crisis, it was a period of change. But when it comes to an actual crisis, yes, this is a very interesting point. How effective is it for owners to return to hands-on operational management during a crisis? At the beginning of the war, many owners did return to operational control. Some of them even dissolved boards of directors that had previously been established in their companies. In your view, how effective can this be? Or on the contrary, how risky?
Is this really about effectiveness? To me, it seems more about cost reduction and speed of decision making. Effectiveness is something quite different because it depends on very specific cases and on the individual capabilities of a particular owner to deal with particular challenges. They may perform better in some situations and worse in others. So I do not think this can be generalized. What can definitely be achieved, however, is cost reduction and faster decision making when certain structures are removed and the owner returns to direct control.
Yes, and if I may add, going back to the family analogy, when a child is ill, it is better to turn to doctors. When an owner rushes in to manage everything personally, what do they fail to see? They fail to see opportunities. Unfortunately, war creates opportunities, any crisis creates opportunities. And when the owner is fully absorbed in day-to-day management, those opportunities are missed, simply because they are not seen.
In your view, can boards be useful in situations where the owner is also the CEO or is directly involved in operational management?
I believe the answer is yes. There are many cases and many examples that support this. Let's first make a distinction. If we are talking about an advisory board to the owner, then of course the owner does not sit on that board because there is no point in advising oneself. The key point is that the owner chooses to use this instrument for a reason. They have started thinking about something. There is something missing, something they want to change, or perhaps 3, 5, or 10 issues they want to address. And for that reason, they decide to introduce this instrument. It becomes a matter of how exactly the board is designed and used. As we know, in the case of supervisory boards, there is an even broader range of formats and options.
This depends on whether there is a clearly owner's request for the board.
And request exists at all.
That distinction matters. Can we recommend that an owner establish a board if the owner is also the CEO?
Why not?
Absolutely, 100%. In my view, this does not depend on that factor at all. It is much more about whether the owner wants to share part of their burden with others. If the mindset is, I can do everything myself, everything depends on me, and I do not need anyone else, then fine, that is a choice. But if that is not the case and there is a desire to share this load either for growth because there is an understanding that additional competencies and experience are needed which the owner does not have and that others can be brought into the same boat, or even with the desire to free up your own time because you also become more liberated. This is due to the fact that some of your functions will be performed or at least assisted by someone else. Then these two motivations work extremely well. In that sense, involving boards can be very attractive for owners.
We once discussed this, and I often refer to such owners as board-ready owners. In other words, owners who are ready for boards, and I think this readiness comes from a combination of factors. But first and foremost, it reflects the owner's willingness to listen to other perspectives, to accept that there are ideas and opinions that may not be as fully formed or as smart as those in their own head. More importantly, to accept that in the dialogue created by the board, a new insight or meaning can emerge, not just by bringing in a consultant to provide input, but through the interaction itself. In the process facilitated by the board and its chair, new ideas can emerge at the intersection of the board member's experience, the owner's perspective, and the top management team. This is a crucial point. The owner must allow the possibility that someone else can add value to the company they founded, the company they started, essentially their child. And this ultimately comes down to trust, because in the end, it's about whether the owner is willing to entrust their child to someone else, understanding that it can bring real value, a broader perspective, deeper experience, and ultimately benefit the company.
A board can also, to some extent, help balance critical issues that the owner may face when managing the operational side of the business.
A kind of moderating or restraining factor, right?
Yes, exactly, a restraining factor. As one owner said, our board helps him avoid destroying the business.
In other words, to protect the business from the owner themselves.
That can certainly be the case. Generally, the role of a CEO or an owner CEO is a very lonely one. I have been in that position myself, and I know that you can't fully share your burdens. There's no one to truly talk to. Of course, you can go for coffee with someone, but they don't understand the context of your business. So while it may sound a bit trivial, this is a real way to share and process the challenges and pains of the role. To share your problems with highly skilled professional people who can help you navigate these challenges more effectively. So I think this is a very human aspect. A humane principle, really. We all experience it, and in practice, the board becomes a professional mechanism to ensure that the CEO is not alone in managing their tasks and responsibilities.
I also want to return to your point, Sergiy, about owner CEOs. This really affects what we call soft skills. These are the skills that board members need to have when the owner is also the CEO. Different soft skills are required from board members to work effectively in these situations.
Directive approaches, for example, can be quite difficult to implement. On the other hand, the owner, if they are involved in operational management, has a deep understanding of all the business nuances. Of course, a board that only meets occasionally and works periodically on company documents cannot match the owner's level of expertise in this specific business. And this raises the question, why have a board in this situation? The owner already knows most of the details and the ins and outs of the business. Yet, the board can still provide additional value that the owner may not see when immersed in the day-to-day operations. If the board consists of independent members, it brings an independent perspective, additional expertise, and a broader understanding of market dynamics and trends. So in this case, what form of board is appropriate? Oversight may not be the primary function of such a board because the owner already has full control as CEO. Instead, the board can focus on development, advisory functions, and strategy. What do you think? Should the board challenge the owner or collaborate with them?
I think the first point is really strategy. Strategic matters because the owner is already involved in operational decisions. As you mentioned, the board brings an external perspective. It is not involved in operations, so it can step back and provide objective insights. That's the first function. The second is risk management or oversight. So in this context, the board's role is more about strategic guidance and risk control rather than direct operational oversight. And the question of succession, for example, this is also important to keep in mind and to help facilitate this process.
You know what I think, continuing Nina's point about the idea of a board that can be reflected upon. In other words, this is important because we have an example from our work where there is an owner who considers the board and then makes their own decision. A board, as an advisory board, of course, advises. It learns afterwards. That is, it calibrates the owner in some way. And here, the principle of board independence is very important because whether the owner realizes it or not, it is precisely the presence of independent board members that gives them the freedom to calibrate. Because if they knew that people were dependent and could not fully express their opinions or criticize what was happening, essentially lacking objectivity, this could be a problem for the owner in relying on this board or on the top management. They could have gathered the top management and consulted in this way, but many owners need a board because the board is independent and they can trust its feedback on what they share.
By the way, I don't agree with the idea that the topic of oversight is irrelevant for an owner CEO, because let's think about it. What I hear from business owners, it seems very often, is that they want to step away from operations. Why? Because it's not interesting, because they want to focus on strategy, on something else. Perhaps something more engaging than operations, oversight versus operations. So it seems to me that this is exactly the answer to the classic request, I want to step away from operations and focus on more strategic matters. Here, the supervisory board is the answer to that question, because the board will oversee while the owner can be part of it and focus on strategic issues.
And sleep peacefully.
The board will ensure that everything in the company is under supervision and that everything is in order.
By being part of it, the owner can observe how things are actually being executed in the company.
The owner, especially if they have been in the CEO role, is a leader. They are an entrepreneur, a leader accustomed to leading people. If they become a board member, of course, they will aim for the position of board chair. How would you evaluate whether this is good or bad when the owner is the chair of the board?
I had such a case in one of the boards where I worked, and I can say that this is not the best solution in the situation where the owner has no experience and hasn't been trained. That's my advice, because it happens that the owner continues to interact with the board as if it were a management team, and it isn't, at least because people meet only once a month. So this leads to a breakdown of some tools that the owner continues to use. They don't work. Therefore, it seems to me that in this situation, the owner should either undergo serious training, understand the difference, and understand the role of the board chair and how it differs from the CEO. Or, if that's not possible, it's better to delegate the chairing role to someone else, because here it's also important to understand. It seems to me that we always have this hierarchical approach where the board chair is seen as the main person who decides everything. But in fact, the board chair is responsible for ensuring that the board works in a structured way, that everyone actually has the agenda, that there is a strategic direction, and that decisions are made collectively. So here it seems this also needs to be understood.
If the owner creates a board, it's always good if they undergo training, even if they just join as a board member, because it is a specific kind of work. As a board chair, well, honestly, if the owner is the board chair, well, that's the owner, and they have taken the task of helping themselves. Well, I agree, even if they are very smart, it won't be a board, it will be some other instrument. If we create a board, let's say a supervisory board with additional powers, the owner should not be the board chair, it should be one of the independent members.
In fact, it's not the CEO. The board chair is more of an administrator, a person who ensures the discussion, ensures the proper flow of decision-making and implementation. Colleagues, we mentioned that a board can be useful to the owner as an independent perspective and also as an opportunity for the owner to step back from operational management and move more toward a strategic level. What else can a board be useful for?
A board, but my point may be also one that acts as a compromise when the owner wants to step away from operations and it's a bit scary, and when they want to leave some. It is both a powerful lever of influence and, in a way, a keyhole through which you can observe what is happening and remain confident and at ease. A board can serve exactly this function. Once you step out of the executive role, you still remain involved in the company's governance in one form or another.
In addition, it seems to me that when an owner wants to step away from day-to-day operations, they very often hire a professional CEO. In reality, however, there is an alternative to establish a board and possibly also appoint a hired CEO. Or not appoint one at all, that is also an option. The point is that the decision to hire a CEO creates a dependency on a single individual. All of us have hired people before, and we understand that this decision does not always turn out to be successful. When the decision to step out of operations involves appointing a board, the owner's risks are significantly reduced because the responsibility is distributed among 4, 5, or 6 professionals and experts. As a result, the human factor, which is always the Achilles heel of any business when one individual turns out to be the wrong fit, is mitigated. From my perspective, this is one of the strongest arguments. In general, the value of a board lies precisely in moving away from dependence on a single individual and distributing responsibility across a group, eliminating that concentration of risk.
Of course, before stepping down from the CEO role, the owner must prepare the company for this transition together with the board, if it has already been established by that time. For a market-hired CEO to successfully take over the management of the company, the business must be sufficiently systematized so that value is not lost during the transition.
One of the board's key responsibilities is precisely to help systematize the company.
Does this also influence the board's composition?
Absolutely. Colleagues, thank you very much for your thoughts. I hope they will be useful both for business owners and for board members.
Thank you.
Thank you, friends.
Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being with us. See you on the Boards of Directors with Sergiy Bulavin channel.